What if everything that we've been told about ADHD, autism, highly sensitives, and nervous system dysregulation is only a part of the picture? What if the brain differences are real, but they're not where the beginning of the story is? What if something is shaping the nervous systems before we ever see the behaviours and before we see the scans? And what if that something is energy? Today I want to stretch this conversation further than I have in my other videos, because the rising number of children being diagnosed means we have to be willing to ask deeper questions. So let's start looking at it from a different angle. Here's what we've been taught. We're told that ADHD and highly sensitive brains are wired differently. We talk about dopamine and hormones and chemicals that are different. We talk about structural variations in areas like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. We talk about executive dysfunction, emotional dysregulation, and sensory overload. So modern neurodiversity, firming approaches, have done a wonderful thing, and they've moved away from calling them deficits. They recognise them as differences. That shift has been vital for dignity, and I'm glad that it's happened. But it is still coming from the physical perspective. It is still looking at what can be scanned, measured, and observed in the body. And that's important, of course. But it may not be the whole picture, because the brain doesn't develop in isolation. The nervous system does not form in a vacuum. Something influences it, and that's the layer I want to talk about. Right now, the conversation has expanded. We're hearing about things that talk deep focus as a natural processing style, double empathy problem, in other words, communication mismatch rather than a deficit, environmental overload, nervous systems reacting to overstimulation, burnout from prolonged masking. When you look at all of those explanations, you start to notice something. Different labels, very similar lived experiences. Heightened awareness, emotional intensity, overwhelm, shutdown, hyperfocus, fatigue. So the question becomes, why are more and more nervous systems calibrating this way? Not what is wrong with them, but why are they forming in this way? We are told these traits run in families, and yes, sometimes they do. But we're also seeing large numbers of children with no obvious generational history. So we have to ask the question, what else might be contributing? Everything we currently know comes from physical measurements, things like brain scans, neurochemistry, behavioural assessments, ticking the boxes and marking the lists. But before anything becomes physical, it exists in energy first. Energy precedes matter. So instead of asking, why is this brain wired this way, we might also ask, at what point did the nervous system begin adapting to intensity? Because that is what I see over and over again. Nervous systems adapted to intensity. Let me introduce you to what I call the energy recipe. Science uses the word epigenetics to describe how environmental influences gene expressions. I use the language of energetic imprint. It's easier to say. Before a child's born, there are already an emotional and energetic environment shaping development. Consider these things. The emotional state of both parents at conception. There's energy input there. The mother's emotional experience when she discovers that she's pregnant. Again, a high emotional point. significant stress, fears, or instability during the pregnancy. Remember, mother-child shares. The collective emotional atmosphere that she is living in. Now, we already know stress hormones cross the placenta, but beyond hormones, there is emotional tone. There is energetic communication. If a developing nervous system is immersed in fear, uncertainty, pressure, or instability, it may calibrate accordingly, not because it is defensive, but because it is adapting. The wiring is not random. It may be responsive. Here is something many don't know. So pause to notice this. If you compare the symptoms, of ADHD, autism, or sensory processing challenges with the list of symptoms from someone who developed PTSD later in life, there is significant overlap. Hypervigilance, executive dysfunction, emotional reactivity, sensory sensitivity, shutdown, and freeze responses. In one case, we call them they were born this way. In the other, we say they adapted to trauma. But both involve a nervous system responding to perceived intensity or the unsafe. That raises important questions. Here is what I'm suggesting. What if within the energy recipe there was a highly intense moment or moments, high levels of it? That intensity can look like chronic stress, anxiety, high-pressure environments, unresolved fear in family lines, a world that feels too fast, too loud, or too demanding. If that intensity is present early enough, a developing nervous system can become highly attuned, highly aware, quick to scan, quick to react. This isn't broken wiring. It is a system designed to survive intensity. But living in that state long term is exhausting. It feels like overwhelm. It feels like emotional dysregulation. It feels like something is wrong, when perhaps what is happening is that the nervous system has been carrying way too much for way too long, and it doesn't know how to change. Now, after birth, the shaping continues. It has the input through parents' emotional states, household atmosphere, school environments, cultural pressure, digital overload. And if a child already has a finely tuned system, they will feel it all, every single bit of it. And because we are not taught that we connect emotionally and energetically, they assume it is all theirs. We label the behaviour instead of understanding the load. So how do you know? How do you know if this is an energy layer relevant to your family? So stop, take a look at the lived experience. If your child swings between the overwhelm, or you, for that matter, swing between overwhelm and shutdown, if you hold it together in some places and collapse in others, if there's reaction feeling bigger than the situation, perhaps there's likely a nervous system living in heightened calibration, and a heightened calibration always has a history. If energy precedes matter, then change must include energy layer, not instead of practical support, not instead of therapy or medical input if needed, but alongside it. We begin with conscious awareness of the emotional state, understanding that children feel what is unspoken, teaching children how to be clear and reset their nervous system, supporting protection and filtering rather than constant coping. This is not about blame. We can only meet our children with the level of regulation that we ourselves have in place. Most of us were never taught how to hold our own energy or to release it, let alone manage a child's. This is about empowerment, because if energy contributed to the shaping, guess what? Energy can also contribute to the recalibration. And this is where the possibilities become exciting. Nervous systems are adaptive. Given the right tools, they can find a calmer baseline permanently. So I'm not dismissing neuroscience. I'm expanding the conversation. The brain is real, the chemistry is certainly real, the structure is real. But they may not be the starting point. If this has actually stretched you a little, then that's okay. That's the idea, to start thinking differently, because we need different answers. Sometimes stretching is how we find those missing pieces. If this has resonated, please subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss any future conversations like this. And if you'd like more support exploring this further, I invite you to join my free school community. It's a space where parents are learning how to understand energy behind the behaviour and create calm, clarity and connection in their home. Because calm doesn't come with control. It starts with connection. Look for the link or the QR code to scan around this video.